Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. My name is Russell Brooks, tonight's host of Inside Scoop. Tonight's program will feature a little-known story about the history of African Americans and the game of basketball. Although African Americans have enjoyed great success in the sport, and the black community has produced some of its most celebrated figures, from Bill Russell to Michael Jordan to LeBron James, few people are familiar with the individual who introduced the sport to Black America. Tonight, we will help fill that gap in our historical awareness. Joining me on our set is Edwin Bancroft Henderson II. His grandfather brought basketball to Black America, and Mr. Henderson tells that story in his book, The Grandfather of Black Basketball, The Life and Times of Dr. E.B. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, welcome to Inside Scoop.
Thanks for having me.
You're very much welcome. Can you tell me about your grandfather, Edwin Bancroft Henderson?
Yes, he was born in Southwest Washington, D.C. His family is from Fairfax County. They were enslaved on the Fitzhugh plantation in Fairfax. It was the largest plantation in Fairfax County. And his grandmother was sold down south into Mississippi, then made her way back and then settled in Southwest D.C. And that's where E.B. was born. His father, who was born in Mississippi, worked, he was in the Navy, and he injured himself, and he never really got better from that. But he met his, my great-grandmother, who was around the corner from him, living in Southwest D.C. and was a domestic. She was born in Williamsburg, and her mother was enslaved, and her father was her owner. Very typical story, actually. E.B.'s mother taught him to read and write at a very young age, and he took to it like a duck to water. And so it was no, it wasn't unusual that he became a prolific writer during his time as an adult. They moved to Pittsburgh for a while, hoping to find better opportunities. But that was interrupted by the strike of 1892 and the Depression of 1893. And they made their way back to Washington, D.C., where his grandmother had a grocery store. And she got a loan from the Freedmen's Bureau, and she had a grocery store in Southwest D.C. And so when they came back during the Depression of 1893, they took over the store, and his grandmother, whose store it was, she bought out the store in Falls Church of her cousin, Fred Foote. Fred Foote was the first town councilman in the town of Falls Church. Before that, he was the town constable. When Falls Church became a town, he was elected to be the town constable, or like the sheriff. And so, and they knew him because he had a grocery store. So he was a known quantity in the neighborhood, and therefore him being elected to public office, you know, and this is like, what, 1875, very early on after the emancipation of African Americans.
And so, coming from that background, how did your grandfather get to Harvard University in that era?
Well, he My grandfather attended M Street High School, which was the predecessor to Dunbar. And after finishing Dunbar, he attended and received a normal school. He went to normal school number 2, or as some people call it, Miners Teachers College. And while he was there, he was introduced to a woman named not Matilda Minor, but Anita Turner. And Anita Turner had gone to Harvard to the Dudley Sargent School for Physical Training, where she had received her certification to be a teacher of physical education. In the early 20th century, the late 19th century, physical education was basically a new subject in the schools. And Dudley Sargent's motto was that exercise is medicine. And so E.B. saw teaching physical education as serving 2 purposes. Number 1, it had a public health initiative where exercise would help to alleviate some of the sedentary diseases that were rampant in the African American community. Many of them were crowded and many times unsanitary. But by getting exercise, you could fight off some of these diseases like tuberculosis and dysentery. The other reason that E.B. saw physical education as attractive to blacks was because he saw that by learning sports, particularly basketball, and other sports as well, that young blacks, particularly those that were academically inclined, like those that went to M Street and Dunbar, could earn scholarships to northern white institutions and debunk the idea of racial inferiority.
And that notion was quite prevalent in that era, that blacks were mentally, maybe even physically, inferior.
That's true. We're dealing with a time when Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. Separate was never equal. But you know, there was second class, blacks were seen as second class citizens. And the way that blacks were seen and talked about in the language of the time was that of buffoonery and very much debauchery in many cases. We weren't good enough, we weren't smart enough, we weren't courageous enough to defeat the white athletes in sports. E.B. knew that that was not true, and he particularly saw basketball as something that's very adaptable to African American abilities. And so he came back from Harvard, where he attended the Dudley Sargent School of Physical Training. Anita Turner was the first one to get her certification to teach physical education. E.B. was the first male to be certified to teach physical education in the United States, in the whole country. And he brought what he learned at Harvard back to Washington. And not only the subject matter, the skills, but also the connections from being a Harvard man helped to usher in an era where he was able to build the infrastructure for African Americans to participate in organized athletics.
So was Washington the birthplace of black basketball?
It is. It is. And there are some people who have said erroneously that E.B. introduced basketball in 1907. However, when he wrote an expose in the Washington Afro when he retired in 1954. I quoted him as saying that he introduced the game in 1904 when he returned from Harvard.
Fascinating. Now, when your grandfather introduced basketball to the black community, what was the reaction? How fast did it catch on?
It caught on immediately. And the way that they did it, there wasn't a lot of indoor venues during the basketball season for African Americans to play. And they played at the New Reformers Hall on U Street, where on the second floor they had a ballroom. And they could retrofit it to have a basketball court, even though it wasn't a regulation-sized court. And you had to watch out for some of the support beams that were in the court. And but it was big enough, and they held several competitions there. They held tournaments there between the teams of the league that he started, the first African American Athletic League, the Interscholastic Athletic Association of Middle Atlantic States. This was the first league, and leagues are important because they create rules for these sports. There are some basic rules, and then there's some other rules specific to the league that you are a member of. But also, my grandfather, and he did this a year before, started an officiating league, the Eastern Board of Officials, in 1905. And the officials are the ones that enforce the rules of the game. And therefore, each sport, there was a recommendation of how many people were needed as referees and officials, because referees are not the only officials in any sport. You have statisticians, you have timekeepers, and many other different kinds of things. Like there was in his book, the Spalding Handbook, for his league, the Interscholastic Athletic Association of the United States, there was at least 15 people that were needed in order to operate a track meet. And so all of the rules and all of the bylaws were actually in this publication.
Wow. It pains me to have to do this, but we're going to have to take a break. But I want the audience to stay tuned, because we'll be back shortly with a bit more of Mr. E.B. Henderson's story. More on Inside Scoop.
Nice going, Spencer! I can't believe we broke Old Man Hennessy's window.
Correction, dude. You broke. I just threw the ball.
This is really bad. What are we gonna do?
We?
Go to the door, ask for the ball back. Are you serious?
It's my ball, Myrtleback.
You're so dead. I'd run away.
Yeah, to Uruguay.
Kiss your life goodbye. Sorry.
Let's go.
Dad.
Yeah, you got me in your well.
Nice one. Some friends you are.
Keep smiling, keep shining.
Hi. Tell him it was an accident, and we can fix the window. Come on. I'll come with you.
Loyalty. Pass it on.
You go first.
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's a matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about rooftop fight. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Yeah.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Awkward. I'm the awkward silence. You try to avoid me, then there I am again.
But an awkward silence can be a great thing.
Like Kelly here is about to demonstrate.
You haven't really been yourself lately. Are you okay?
Find out how you can help a friend with their mental health at seizetheawkward.org.
we're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
We are back with Edwin Bancroft Henderson II, author and founder of the Tenor Hill Heritage Foundation. We are discussing his grandfather, Dr. E.B. Henderson, who is featured in his book, The Grandfather of Black Basketball. You mentioned that your grandfather started the first association or league, helped referees or train them to officiate this sport. I think you also mentioned about a publication to highlight the achievements of African Americans in sports. Yes. What was the motivation for that particular project?
Well, I believe, I have the letters from Spalding. It was the Spalding official handbook for the Interscholastic Athletic Association of Middle Atlantic States. And my grandfather was always an avid writer. And he had met a number of people while he was at Harvard, one of which was James E. Sullivan, who was also, in addition to being over the Spalding publications, he was also the president of the AAU. And I have the letters. When E.B. wanted to write this book to highlight his league, but also the participation of African Americans participating in sports. This was a very pivotal time in the advent of African American participation. And one of the reasons why E.B. started his league was because after conversations with Mr. Sullivan, it became clear that because of segregation, that the black teams were not going to be able to join the AAU, which was a strictly white league, and play against and compete against the white teams. And he was encouraged by Mr. Sullivan to start his own league. So he did. Shortly after that, the New York athletic clubs, who were busy in participating in sports in New York, started their own league, the Olympian Athletic League, the OAL. But back to why he wrote the book, I think he wrote the book because there were so many teams that were being started, not only by the schools, but also the HBCUs, who also couldn't compete against white colleges either. And there was a lot of talent that was being cultivated, and being an avid writer, he wanted to write about it.
Mm-hmm. For our younger viewers who may not be familiar with this, I have to imagine that African American women who may have enjoyed the sport didn't get the opportunity to play, unlike today's WNBA. Did your father or anything that you've read discuss that particular issue, that women weren't given those opportunities?
Actually, women were playing.
Ah.
And women were playing basketball before the men were playing basketball. When the game was introduced in 1904 at the St. Louis Olympics, or the St. Louis World's Fair, and the St. Louis Olympics, both of which were in St. Louis, it was a team, a girls' team, a women's team, from an Indian school who were the exhibitioners of how the sport was played. Okay? So, and at Minor Teachers College, there was a girls' team as well. So if there was a girls' team at Minor Teachers College, I would imagine there were some girls' teams at other schools as well. Now, the game of basketball for girls was very different from boys, and whereas the men played full court, in the girls' game, there were two players that always stayed behind in the defensive court. And the boys' game was actually very different too. Basketball, when E.B. played, my grandfather was known as the best center in basketball at that time.
How tall was
5 feet 10 inches of him. And mostly it was because of his knowledge of the game, his strategy in the game. And this guy from the New York World, a black publication from New York, Romeo Doherty, said as much that E.B. was the best center in basketball between 1908 and 1910. But the girls, they play. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was that after each basket, there was a jump ball at center court. Another aspect of the game then was that there was a lot of set shooting. There wasn't any dunking, and mostly they were passing. Just think of it mostly as a game of like soccer, like an aggressive game of keep away.
So that sounds like a low-scoring game.
The scores were very low back then. If you scored in the high 20s or low 30s, then you had a really high score. Whereas today, it's not unusual for someone to, as we used to say, bust the clock or score over 100 points.
How about jump shooting? You said there were no dunking, but what did they do to score? I can't imagine it was all layups.
Well, it was layups and there was set shots. I imagine there were jump shots too. But the scoring was secondary to passing and keeping it away.
Okay. You mentioned the role of HBCUs.
Yes. Yes.
Giving these players and probably coaches and officials the opportunities that they couldn't find at that time in predominantly white institutions. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And because the game sort of began here in Washington, did Howard have sort of an advantage as compared to maybe some of the other schools at that time?
Well, my grandfather started the team at the 12th Street YMCA. And a lot of people would think that when they played that the players got paid, but they didn't. And the whole point of starting the team at the 12th Street YMCA was actually to raise money to build the YMCA, because when he started the team in 1908 or 1909, well, Teddy Roosevelt had just laid the cornerstone for the YMCA in 1908. And so they were actively building and raising money, facilitated by 2 matching grants, one from the Rockefellers and one from the Rosenwalds, both for $25,000. But through his work in playing, they raised enough money, and because of all of that, my grandfather was given a $20 gold piece for being the person who helped to raise the most money. Did I go off track?
No, you didn't, but let me take another question.
Sure. Your
father's a great man. He accomplished a lot in circumstances that had to be extremely difficult. I have to believe other people at different points recognized the incredible things that he accomplished. Are you the first person to write about him?
No, actually no. My parents actually wrote a book about my grandfather. It was published in 1985, entitled Molder of Men. However, it's only 40 pages and 100 pages of indices, or appendices, should I say. There's a gentleman named, let me see.
Well, if you don't remember the name, that's
David
fine.
Wiggins. David Wiggins,
okay.
Who is a member of a well, he was a professor at George Mason University, but he was also a member of a group called AFERT, the American Alliance for Physical Education, for Health, Physical Education, Dance and Exercise and Dance, which is the leading auxiliary for physical education, physical educators. But also, he wrote several books as well. And Arthur Ashe mentioned my grandfather in his book, Hard Road to Glory, which was also a book about African American athletics.
Right.
And in addition to the Spalding book, my grandfather wrote The Negro in Sports at the behest of Carter G. Woodson. And when, after Arthur Ashe had written his book, he was interviewed on the Today Show by Brian Gumbel, where Brian Gumbel asked him, why did you write this book, Arthur? Surely this isn't the first time this subject has been written about. And Arthur Ashe said, no, yes, you're right. The first one to do it was Edwin Henderson, the first public appointed physical educator in the Washington, D.C. colored schools.
So I have to ask then, if your grandfather's been written about previously, what did you want to accomplish in your book?
The whole story. I felt that my parents writing the 40 pages was not worthy of the greatness of this man. And I believe that this is not just about basketball. This is not just about my grandfather, but this is about him in context of what Black America was between the 1880s and the 1970s.
Understood. Well, I'm really enjoying this conversation, and it pains me to say this, but we must take another break. So I ask our audience to stay tuned, and we'll return shortly with more of this great conversation, more on Inside Scoop.
Okay, so we drowned the fire, stirred it, drowned it again, and now just feel if it's cold.
Yeah.
Cool.
Smokey just gave me a bear hug.
I know. Already posted it.
I got a crick in my neck, limp in my step, cramping in my muscles every time I try to flex. All of the ones get on. Very exciting, all that I can do was remember you. You know I usually say no, but if you throw me love, I'll throw you some more.
It's a big responsibility.
Oh, it's huge. I know, it's huge.
And the salary.
Oh my god, yes.
Right?
I mean, like, I was about to move in with my parents, and right before, so this saved me.
I really believe in you, you know?
Thank you. It's nice to hear that from someone.
These are cool. Did you, what did you?
to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Again, we're joined by the author of The Grandfather of Black Basketball, Edwin Bancroft Henderson II. Your grandfather was also a civil rights pioneer right here in Virginia. Can you describe that part of his life?
Sure. My grandfather, after the basketball championship between New York and Washington, D.C., or rather the Olympian League and the Interscholastic Athletic Association, my grandparents got married and they moved to Falls Church. And they moved in with his grandmother and his parents. I don't know that I would like to do that when I get married, but it was, they wanted to raise the family away from the hustle and the bustle of the city. And shortly after they moved here, you know, there was a lot of things that were going on. His father was thrown from the trolley line, and there was a court case about that, which was actually very telling. But then, around 1915, with the advent of the movie Birth of a Nation, the complexity of race relations in this country became very complicated.
Now, again, for our younger members of the audience, could you briefly describe the film Birth of a Nation?
Oh yeah, Birth of a Nation was a film by W.D. Griffith that was first titled, and the book was actually titled The Klansman, and it showed black people as criminals, as sex offenders, rapists, and also as very timid and lacking courage. And this film also ushered in a new era in the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. But also in Falls Church in 1915, there was an ordinance that was proposed by the town council that would have limited where blacks could live or own land. And they cut up Falls Church into 4 districts, 3 of which were known for whites only, and would have been known as sundown districts. In other words, like sundown towns. You better not be, if you were black, you better not be caught in this part of town after sundown. And the area that they had set aside for blacks was only about 5% of the town. There were many blacks that actually owned homes in these areas that were designated for whites only. And they would, if this would have happened, these people would have eventually been forced out because they would have found it very difficult to live there. Well, my grandfather and my grandmother were both members of the NAACP in Washington, D.C. That chapter was started in 1913. It was started by the brother of the pastor of my grandmother's church at the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, Archibald Grimke.
And your grandmother was Mary Ellen Henderson?
Or sometimes known as Nellie.
Okay. And I raised that because, correct me if I'm wrong, but a school is named after her now?
Yes, in Falls Church. Yeah. And that was happening through the efforts of Tenor Hill and a matter of tenacity and pushing the envelope on my part and my wife's part. But back to the point here, E.B., when he learned about the ordinance in January of 1915, called a meeting at the home of Joseph Tenor, who was a stonemason and was known for his oratory skills. And they brought together 9 men who were known as the pillars of that community, and they started a group called the Colored Citizens Protective League. Now, the Colored Citizens Protective League was there to try to fight against this ordinance. And so Joseph Tenner became the president, and my grandfather, being the educator and the writer, became the secretary and was responsible for all of the correspondence. And so they started a letter writing campaign to all of the businesses, all of the churches, and all of the town councilmen, asking where did they stand on this issue. Well, they even though many of the churches and the businesses were not in favor of the ordinance passed in the town council, and then they put it forth to the town in a referendum vote, and that also passed. Immediately after it passed, the Colored Citizens Protective League filed a suit against the city in Circuit Court, Fairfax County Circuit Court, and which placed an injunction on the enforcement of the ordinance. The judge that was going to rule over the case was was invited to come out to Falls Church, and after my grandfather showed him around, the judge decided that he would not rule on the case. He would not rule on the case because there was a similar case coming before the United States Supreme Court. That court case was called Warley, W-A-R-L-E-Y, versus Buchanan. And it was argued before the Supreme Court by the president of the NAACP at the time, Moorfield Story, who was a white lawyer from Boston. He was the president of the NAACP for the first 18 years of the organization. And the ruling in the case that came down was that such ordinances were unconstitutional. However, many states still around the country, through nullification and other tactics, still enforce these kinds of rules. But when this went to the Supreme Court here in Falls Church, that rule was struck down. However, the law still stayed on the books until 1998, the year after the Tenner Hill Heritage Foundation was established, and the story came before the mayor of Falls Church at the time, who immediately took it off of the books.
Excellent. Now, you followed in the footsteps of your grandfather in terms of your service to your community via the Tenner Hill Heritage Foundation. I understand the foundation's mission is to research, preserve, and celebrate the African American and civil rights history of Falls Church, Fairfax County. Now, can you describe your ongoing work and what you've accomplished?
Well, I think the larger picture is that we have helped to shape a different narrative, or to change the narrative. The first thing that we did was to build a monument to the civil rights movement, the early civil rights movement, because many in our schools, they truncate the civil rights movement to the years between Rosa Parks and the Voting Rights Act, a 10-year period. But in reality, the civil rights movement is much wider and longer than that. And this 1915 period, I think you would say, is a early civil rights movement. But there was civil rights struggles from the whole time that African Americans or Africans were here in the Americas.
I think you're absolutely right. But the fact that this narrative exists, and so many people have maybe a distorted notion of the civil rights movement, that raises the question as to how well we are sharing that history, especially with our young people, especially in Falls Church.
You know, when we wanted to build our historic site, and I was having a discussion with one of our partners in the endeavor, the Nova Parks, when I told him about the history and he was reading about the history, he was saying, "Oh, it's such a depressing story." And I said, "No, it's not. When people come together to fight against injustice and are triumphant, that is a glorious story, a triumphant story. And how can you feel bad about that? You know, the human spirit is full of stories like this. Our history is full of stories like this, of the generosity and the courage that it took to fight against injustice. And when you are able to tell that story, it helps people to understand that we're not second-class citizens. We're not second-class people. There is genius in our bones and in our DNA. And that is what I hope that we're able to share with people. Right now, there are two things that Tinner Hill is involved with. Number one is we are embarking on a mural district along Lee Highway, or I hate to call it Lee Highway, and in Falls Church City it's actually called South Washington Street, in the area that is Tinner Hill, across from our monument at Tinner Hill Road and South Washington Street. The other thing that we're doing is we're working with the city to create a Tinner Hill Historic and Cultural District. And we're working with the city, we're working with the planning department to put Tinner Hill into the comprehensive plan. And through that, we believe that Tinner Hill will have even a greater emphasis on telling the story of Falls Church that will include the African American history, that will include the civil rights history. And we will do part of that in visuals that the 22,000 people that drive up and down Lee Highway every day will get to see without even getting out of the comfort of their cars.
Well, I hope you're correct, and I hope they actually do get out of their cars and maybe learn a little bit more about the wonderful history, the inspiring history that you've described about that community. Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, we have to take another short break, but I do want the audience to stay with us because there's much more to learn if you stay with us here on Inside Scoop.
Okay. Your time is gonna come. It's up to you to reach out to be that friend who comes along. Your day is gonna come.
When you make a friend, you make a difference.
Your day is gonna come.
Friendship. Pass it on. A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
Good one, son.
Last summer, my new dad took me on vacation. First, we went deep sea fishing.
Wow! I'm so proud of you, son.
And then we went on Thunder Shark.
That was awesome! Let's go again.
3 times. I gotta say, it was pretty cool.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Thousands of kids in foster care will take you just as you are.
What's it feel like when a woman's having a heart attack? Chest pain, like there's a ton of weight on your chest. Severe shortness of breath. Unexplained nausea. Cold sweats. There's an unusual tiredness and fatigue. There's unfamiliar dizziness or lightheadedness. Unusual pain in your back, neck, jaw, one or both arms, even your upper stomach are signs you're having a heart attack. Don't make excuses. Make the call to 911 immediately. Learn more at womenshealth.gov/heartattack.
Operation Wonder Park is a go!
There's nothing more powerful than imagination.
Honey, have you seen my cell phone?
But don't just imagine.
My park came to life?
Ooh, a plot twist.
Use STEM to build, create.
She did it.
And change the world.
Who's with me?
I'm more of a 2 feet on the ground kind of guy.
It's gonna hurt
it tomorrow.
If she can STEM, so can you. Find out more at She Can STEM.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Thank you. We're having a great conversation with our special guest, Edwin Bancroft Henderson II, who's telling us all about the riveting story of his grandfather, the grandfather of black basketball. But I'm interested in this final segment to talk a little bit more about some of the other things that both you and he were involved in. Now, I know you are a life member of the NAACP.
Yes.
But I think you would agree that civil rights organizations do not hold the same place in African American life as they did during maybe the 1950s and 60s, as an example. Why is that?
Well, I have an opinion.
That's why we're here. We want to hear your opinion.
They were more needed in the 50s and 60s because we were not at the point where the Public Accommodations Law of 1964 was created, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we were not able to vote in many of the southern states. And as Martin Luther King said, you know, like you had black people in the South that could not vote, and you had people in the North that felt they had nothing for which to vote. I think that a lot of times we take some stuff for granted. And as a teacher in the Fairfax County Public Schools for the better part of 20 years on Gallows Road at Luther Jackson Middle School, people think that history is so long ago. And I've seen it in my lifetime, and it's not that long ago. You know, the Public Accommodations Law was actually a Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court a few years later because public opinion had changed to address, and you know, the troops were taken out of the South in 1877, the end of Reconstruction. I think that we've come a long way in those first years, but we seem to be in a backslide. I think several years ago in the early 2000s when they shot down Article 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that there's been an assault on voting rights. The original reason for what is it? The original reason, okay, in the 1970s, there was an effort to wrong some of the rights. Blacks had been kept out of many industries for a long time.
Right.
Not because they weren't qualified, but just because of the color of their skin. And then when we tried to correct that, the Bakke case.
Yes, affirmative action.
Affirmative action, yes, thank you. Affirmative action was shot down, and many of the things that black people fought for, put their lives on the line for in the 50s and 60s, didn't just benefit blacks,
sure,
but it benefited women.
Mm-hmm. And other
all
minorities,
races,
right?
Immigrants,
mm-hmm.
LGBTQ plus,
mm-hmm.
you know. But our example and our struggle was the catalyst for all of that.
Now, we saw a surge in what was called the racial reckoning during the Black Lives Matter campaign, and certainly following the death of George Floyd.
Yes, yes, yes.
But I think people would say that that energy has ebbed. One, do you agree? And if so, how do we reinvigorate the movement?
Well, you know, what happened to George Floyd was, on camera, was nothing new that has been happening in America for hundreds of years. I think as we get further and further away, people seem to slide back into their old way of thinking, or it loses its strength, its focus. And I think that the critical race theory issue that many people are bringing up is really a backlash to that, but also to the struggle for equity and inclusion in our country. And I think that we've been struggling with that, and this whole, I don't know any black people that use the word woke anymore, but it seems to be on the tongues of many
I think
white people.
I think that's
that
Governor
are
DeSantis' favorite word.
Who?
Governor DeSantis.
DeSantis, yeah, you know, it's so ridiculous, you know, and he needs to wake up, you know, but the thing about it is that I remember a time when black people were not seen on TV.
Yes.
We were not in commercials. And now, you know, you look at it and there's, you know, many shades of people in commercials. I don't believe that we're going back to the day where we won't see black people in commercials.
We hope not.
I think that that genie's already out the bottle. And so whatever, you know, you want to do, I think that we're moving towards, I hope that we're moving towards the multicultural nation which we are, where, and I think that many young people are not buying into a lot of this negative rhetoric. Mm-hmm. And I just hope that we're not going to go backwards. America needs to go forward, and unless we do, I feel that America will continue to slide backwards. There are many nations that have, in the early 20th century, America was seen as, you know, the #1 in this and the #1 in that, #1 in education. But little by little, we're sliding, and I think that it's due to racism and I think we have to reconcile with America's original sin.
Okay. Well, one example of forward movement, of progress, was the fact that your grandfather was enshrined into the National Basketball Hall of Fame in 2013. How did you feel? How did that affect you?
Well, it didn't just happen. My wife and I, we first nominated my grandfather to the Basketball Hall of Fame for the class of 2006. And we realized that the 138-page booklet that we had created and sent 28 copies of to the Hall of Fame didn't get opened. And so the next year, we did a 7-minute video and burned 28 DVDs and sent that up there. The following year, we did, I got the footage from the Today Show with Arthur Ashe and put that in there along with footage interviewing the owner of the Mystics, what's her name?
Well, I know who you're speaking of,
Yeah.
the television executive,
Yeah.
Kathy Hughes, right?
No, Bob Johnson's wife.
Yeah.
Well, Miss Johnson.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know, we kept moving forward, we kept doing things, and you know, that's why, you know, the foreword of my book is written by a Hall of Fame journalist, for basketball, named David Aldridge.
Oh, yes.
And what he said was that, you know, the Hendersons, they kept pushing, they didn't give up, and well, really, I have to give my kudos to the man that was the owner of the Harlem Globetrotters, Manny Jackson, who in 2012, or maybe 2011, created a special elect category. Oh, Manny Jackson. He was the chair of the Basketball Hall of Fame, and he instituted a special elect category for African American pioneers. And that's how he got in.
Okay, that's a pretty incredible story. Now, you've wrote one book on your grandfather. Should we expect another book anytime soon?
I'm considering it, but right now my hands are full as far as getting this book in front of as many people as possible and getting this story out, and hopefully making it so that it's not just a Washington story. It's not just a Washington Wizards story. The Wizards have been very instrumental in honoring E.B. Henderson. But this should be something that is seen by all 32 teams in the National Basketball Association. That's what I feel. If you look at the court, you have to understand that through the work of E.B. Henderson, the sport went from isolation, where they were not allowed to play the sport, to domination of the sport.
Domination of the sport. That's
well,
pretty impressive.
Look at the court today. 75% of all the players are African Americans. So surely E.B. was right in thinking that blacks were particularly adapted to the sport.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, so let me thank you, Mr. Henderson, for joining us tonight on Inside Scoop and sharing the story of your grandfather and his contributions to African Americans, the sport of basketball, and the civil rights movement here in Virginia. And for our audience, I hope you will join us again for Inside Scoop.